So I decided to pull architecture out. Normally, I would just cover this in the tail end of a lecture, but I wanted to pull it out so you were able to see the individual growth in architecture. Um, it is just simply modern to postmodern. So this is Adolf Loos. He was the most influential architect in Germany during the late 20th century. He trained in Dresden. He was German, and he moved to the U.S. in 1893 for about 3 years. He moved here to participate in the Columbia Exposition in Chicago. And during that time, he studies Louis Sullivan. Louis Sullivan thought that a building's contribution to society could be analyzed just by its mass and proportion. After studying Sullivan's work, Luce writes an essay called The Ornamentation and Crime. In this essay, he rejects the highly decorative process of Art Nouveau and compares it to the tattooing of non-Christian indigenous people who at that time were looked at as savages. He uses minimalist theories to design a home for the painter Lily Steiner. This particular work is one of Luce's most significant and well-known works of art. In this view, certain aspects have been stressed, such as functional coherence, the absence of ornamentation, spatial economy, the use of the flat roof on the garden side, the reduction of the external image to pure white shell. Luce was the most influential architect in Germany during the 20th century. His design is not so much about reduction of tradition, but an update to the old design ideas of the earlier Viennese architects that came before him, especially in the Steiner House. He ties the house to traditional architectural elements in Vienna through the materials that he uses, like lime mortar and sheet metal. The lime mortar was the way that the walls were all fit together. The sheet metal is the material in the roof. They were all materials that were used in the local historical area of that time. The landscape that the house sits on dictates its form to the hillside. Here, the form follows the function in a cube-like design with a U-shaped garden and a curved roof line that mimics the terrain of the hillside. You can see that the house sits on a hill. The front of the house slopes up gently to sort of embrace the hill. And then the back of the house accounts for the hill's slope and is much longer than the front of the house. This idea of form follows function is the idea that whatever is there is only there for structural purposes. Nothing is there that isn't for some specific use. Another one of our architectural superstars is Mies van der Rohe. Mies van der Rohe was an architect who felt that less is more. He designs the Barcelona Pavilion. He designs the German pavilion in the Barcelona Pavilion in the International Exposition in Barcelona, Spain in 1929. The building was used for the official opening of the German section of the exhibition. Van der Rohe's work is known for its simple form and its spectacular use of extravagant materials such as marble, red onyx, and travertine. He mimics the same features of minimalism and as Adolf Loos does. He, like most architects at this time, not only designed the interior of the space, the exterior of the space, but they also design the furniture that goes in the space. And so he makes these chairs called the Barcelona chairs. They're the white chairs in the upper right-hand corner that you see in the slide. Those chairs are famous. They are, if you run across a Barcelona chair in your time in an antique mall, you will realize that they are extraordinarily expensive. And they were first designed here for the International Pavilion in Barcelona. Another architectural genius that we see come to light in the 50s is Mies van der Rohe. Mies van der Rohe is a member of the Bauhaus until Hitler closes it down in 1933. While he's at the Bauhaus, he develops a building concept that changes architecture forever. He combines thin sheet glass with steel inserts to support it. The sheets of glass have an irregular shape, and the shape captures, or the irregular shape of the glass has the ability to catch and reflect light. This was a model that he created, and it sat in the front of the Bauhaus's building for a long time. He sort of developed this idea or artistic approach to architecture with Gropius. Because of this model and this vision that Van der Rohe had, the subsequent modern buildings were built with this idea of the light catching, or the building's facade catching the light and bouncing it back off of the building. Because of this concept being introduced by Van der Rohe, we end up with the legacy of skyscrapers that you see today in urban areas. Ones that are tall and massive that combine windows and steel together. They begun with Mies van der Rohe's building model on the right here. The simple design aesthetic that was developed by Gropius and Van der Rohe was known as the International style. Because it was simple, it had a universal design sense that was desired all over the world. Le Corbusier was trained in Paris and Berlin and was an architect, but he was also a painter. He was highly influential in modern architectural scene, and he believed that every human being had a basic need for sun, space, vegetation, temperature control, good ventilation, and insulation against noise. The basic concept that he designs, he dubs a machine for living. He thought that a house was a humankind's assertion with nature. He designs a house called the Villa Savoye. Actually, I'm sorry. It's the Villa Savoye. It's a country estate in rural Paris. It had partially confined ground floor that originally had a 3-car garage. It had bedrooms, a bathroom, a utility room, and a rooftop terrace with a garden. There were open windows all the way around the minimalistic home. The interior is open, bright, and airy with minimal structural obstruction to allow light to flood into the open space. It has a spiral staircase and an intentional flooring that switches up and changes back with seamless flow. A feature that one would not expect from looking at the exterior of this building. When you're inside this house, the flooring directs you to where you go, and then it will switch to a different pattern so that the person who's following it is in this specific space. So the kitchen flooring goes in one direction, living room flooring goes into a different direction, and that's how he differentiates space. Here is the Villa Savoy without any layering of information on top of it. Just nice for you to be able to see the entire building. This is Eros Saarinen Transworld Airlines Terminal from John F. Kennedy Airport in New York. The building was designed by Saarinen with the dramatic sweeping curvilinear lines that are without ornamentation. The dramatic lines were designed to mimic the fluid dynamic sense of motion that's associated with the wind and patterns of flight. Saarinen also designed ventilation ducts and signboard for the building. And because of this building, he was on the team that selected the architect who would design the Sydney Opera House in Australia. This is the Sydney Opera House looking east in Sydney, Australia. Utzon worked with Frank Lloyd Wright at Talisman. And his design for the Sydney Opera House reflects bold, dynamic lines, curves from shell-like masses that are heavy at the base, culminating into soaring peaks at the top, one of which is 200 feet tall. While it has a sweeping, dynamic structure like Le Corbusier, it has a sense of organicness that mimics the sea and its surroundings, a quality that I suspect Uten picked up from working with Frank Lloyd Wright at Talisman. This is Frank Lloyd Wright. He is an architect. Frank Lloyd Wright was a genius. He graduated from high school at the age of 14, went on to college, and by the time he was 17 or 18, had a full college education. He was not very respectful of women, and he, in some regard, was so smart that he was almost socially awkward. As an architect, one of his most famous buildings is the Kaufman House that he calls Falling Water. Its architecture is organic and fluid. It interacts with the landscape instead of encroaches on it. Frank Lloyd Wright believed in pure forms with little ornamentation. The Kaufman House has cantilevered levels to integrate with the setting that it sits in. He is an architecture of space, not of mass. Sorry about that. My finger pushed the button to move to the next slide. So I was in the middle of telling you that the terraces have been a challenge for them to keep structurally sound. The terraces are made of reinforced steel cording and blown concrete. When I was, you can see here the steps that go to the pool below. So this is the area where the floor opens up and you can dive into the water. Right now, the water isn't high enough to dive into, but I thought you'd find that interesting to see that detail. What else do I want to tell you about this building? There is another small building that's attached to the house. When you go outside, I forget exactly what's in there. When you go on a tour, there's like a movie, I think, that you watch there about Frank Lloyd Wright's achievements and things like that. So I highly encourage you, if you ever think that you might like to see Falling Water, I just encourage you to go. I think your student discount gets you in for $50-ish. It's not cheap to go and visit. The foundation uses the money to keep the structure in good repair, but you can go for free. It's situated on like 100 miles of hiking trails. So, or over 100 acres of hiking trails. So I highly encourage you to go to Bear Run, Pennsylvania and see Falling Water. This is Frank Lloyd Wright's studio called Taliesin West. There were two Taliesins, one in Missouri and one in Arizona. The one in Scottsdale, Arizona was the one that Frank Lloyd Wright used for his studio. He added to this building from the time it started till the time it finished. He really never quit working on it. As time progressed in his life, Talisman in Missouri had burnt down twice. And the first time it burnt down, somebody deliberately burnt it down. And 7 of the people that lived there were murdered, including his wife. I guess she wasn't his wife. She was his partner and her 2 children. So he had an interesting life in that he suffered some tragedy. And his buildings, his architectural visions were things that he cherished and knew intimately, the way an artist knows their art. He lived at Taliesin West and had his studio there. And he was the only one other than his interns who worked on, or his apprentices, I'm sorry, who worked on the building. And so I think that the Taliesin West was probably the place that he felt most attached to in his life. You can see that same organic cantilevered architecture style is prevalent here in Frank Lloyd Wright's design. This is the west side of the building. The very top floor has windows all the way around. You can see out into the landscape of Scottsdale, Arizona from those windows. When you are in Frank Lloyd Wright's buildings, you see what he wanted you to see. The building is designed in a way that he controls your experience in the building by making certain design decisions. At Falling Water, the design decision to make the ceiling fairly low and the floor fairly close, and it all be a color that blends in with the nature. That aesthetic alone is really priceless in terms of as an experience in being in one of his houses. Talisman was no exception to Wright's desire to have his building blend in with the landscape so that the people inside could experience the landscape at all times. Eventually, he adds 2 movie theaters and an additional studio here at Talisman. He also adds studio headquarters for his apprentices. Um, yeah, in this area. I think the thing that we know Frank Lloyd Wright, or most people know Frank Lloyd Wright for, was his design of the Guggenheim building in New York in the 40s. Um, the larger building that's connected to the spiral building was designed in 1992 by a different architect. The Guggenheim building was originally designed by Frank Lloyd Wright to showcase Peggy Guggenheim's collection of Kandinsky paintings. The building is meant to direct the viewer from a in sort of a linear pathway. As you enter the building, there's a spiral walkway that gradually ascends to the top floor. There's one elevator in the building, and there's a restroom on every other level, I believe. The one elevator only holds a few people at a time because the building is meant to showcase Kandinsky's paintings and for the viewer to be an extension sort of the building itself. Frank Lloyd Wright designs the building with a gradual ramp that starts at the base of the building and, like I said, ascends to the top 5th floor, I believe. It houses Kandinsky's paintings. If you remember what Kandinsky's paintings look like, they have lines, and they're expressionist paintings that seem to be so directional that it feels as if the lines just jet off of the canvases. The walls have a convex shape. No, I'm sorry. They have a concave shape. Just slightly so. And the Kandinsky paintings are hung on the walls. Now, I'm talking solely about Kandinsky because the building was originally designed to showcase Peggy Guggenheim's collection of Kandinsky paintings. But now, today, it houses many works of modern art. But you feel when you are in the building, when you look at a painting that is an expressionist painting like a Kandinsky, as if the lines continue onto the walls and past the walls, sort of into infinity. And partly is to do with the shape of the wall, the color of the wall, and the way the building is shaped. Frank Lloyd Wright also designed a church. Before he designs Fallingwater and the Guggenheim, his career was just beginning in Oak Park, Illinois. I've always wanted to go to Oak Park, Illinois. I have never been. It is the largest collection of Frank Lloyd Wright buildings in the entire world, I believe. One of the buildings that is featured there is the Unity Temple. It was completed in 1908, and it was a replacement for the Unitarian Universalist Church that had burned down in 1905. Frank Lloyd Wright was a member of that church. And it is poised as an important work for the modernist movement in the early 20th century. But it was also the foundation for which the Prairie School would originate. The Unity Temple was not just an ordinary commission for Wright, because he was a member at the church. For Wright, the church was meant to be a temple for man to worship God. which coincided with Wright's decision to abandon the typical New England Unitarian white steeple architectural style for a more modern concrete aesthetic. The church's budget was relatively low for a project of this scale. It was approximately $40,000. And so because of this, he uses reinforced concrete. It's a lot more economically feasible, and because it's located on a busy main street in Oak Park, the noise level on the street is fairly intense, and so the concrete the sound doesn't bounce off of the concrete's interior quite the way it would if it were made of a different material. It is also why the church is windowless. It doesn't have any windows except for the clerestory at the very top. The windows are also placed in a recessed area of the facade. The Unity Temple was designed as a bipart building that locates the temples at the center of the building and connects to a community center through a low-level corridor. Unlike the iconic buildings that Wright had designed later in the 20th century, the Unity Temple does not employ a low horizontal profile. Rather, the space and volume was more important than the walls. Here you see interior shots of the Unity Temple. You can see he adds a second choir loft at the top along with the clerestory. The lights all come from the ceiling downward. And this is the definition of the Prairie style. The Prairie style utilizes simple horizontal lines that make the space feel more intimate. He also designs, I believe, the pipe organ and where the pipe organ goes within the temple. This building I threw in here because it's a really important building, and I just thought, hey, why not? We should talk about this. This building is a loop of 6 horizontal and vertical sections. It's the CCTV headquarters in Beijing, China. It was built in 2004, between 2004 and 2008. It was built in 3 separate sections that are joined together, creating half sections. Joined together, creating 1.5 sections. The building was a part of a media park designed to form a landscape of public entertainment and outdoor filming. Production studios were there. And when the building was built, Beijing was in the midst of a major modernization push. Sorry, my words got all jumbled up. The legs of the building taper as they rise, so that slightly different heights and distortions to the viewer's sense of perspective sort of occur. Koolhaas's work deals with exposing conflicting energies at work in society. He represents the most obvious signs of human scale, like the repetitive windows and the floor slabs of a conventional tower. The forms are a reworking of classical perspective. The irregular structure is an attack on modernist ideas about structural purity. The design is also striving to make room for the impurities and imperfections that make us human.